Hardly daring to breathe, the escapers left their hut and as silently as possible scampered across the hard-pressed dirt towards the low perimeter fence. The men had blackened their faces with soot from the hut stove, but they still felt desperately exposed in the semi-darkness of the camp. Several men among them felt a spot itch between their shoulder blades where they expected a bullet at any second. They silently dropped to the dirt beside the fence and lay still for a few seconds, straining their ears like animals for danger. Their breath plumed above their heads in the cold air, but nothing appeared amiss. The camp was quiet, except for the sounds of coughing coming from the freezing huts. Carefully and deliberately, one of the men drew a metal spoon from his jacket pocket and started to scratch at the earth beneath the fence. Like rabbits, the escapers would dig a shallow trench beneath the perimeter wire and then squeeze underneath. Another of the escapers also started digging, while two others moved the dirt with their hands, and another kept watch. The sudden sound of footfalls caused the escapers to freeze. Pressing themselves into the earth, they watched as a Japanese sentry strolled casually along the perimeter fence towards them, his rifle with its long bayonet twinkling like a baleful star in the poor light. The guard walked closer and closer without seeing the 5 men who wished with every fibre of their beings that the earth would swallow them. But suddenly the guard halted, about-faced, and started to walk back the way he had come. The men collectively let out a sigh of relief and went back to their excavations. Within minutes they had scraped away sufficient soil to make a trench, and hardly pausing for breath, they began to duck under the fence one by one. Once through, they quickly fled into the darkness beyond the camp, aiming to place as much distance between themselves and the camp as they humanly could before sunrise. Among them was the American commander of the legendary last stand on Wake Island in December 1941, the indomitable Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham. The escapers were free of the camp, but very far from real freedom. Winfield Cunningham never abandoned his will to resist the Japanese. He had led the defense of Wake Island, one of the greatest last stands of the Second World War, endured brutal capture, and managed to successfully escape from captivity twice before. Cunningham was imprisoned in some of the most notorious jails in the Japanese Empire, but his spirit of resistance remained undiminished. Although pronounced officially dead by his own government after Wake, Cunningham was a born survivor and an inspirational leader whose story has become sadly overshadowed by some of the other Wake Island heroes. Cunningham, though a prisoner, was undefeated. In January 1941, the US Navy had begun construction of a permanent base on the tiny Pacific atoll lying between Hawaii and Guam that was only 2.5 square miles, and which included a modern airfield. Elements of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, amounting to 449 officers and men, formed a permanent garrison and was supported by Marine Corps Fighter Squadron VMF 211, operating 12 outdated Grumman F-4F Wildcats. There were also 68 US Navy personnel and 1,150 civilian contractors on the island when the Japanese attack came. Several First World War vintage 5-inch guns from a defunct American cruiser had been emplaced at strategic points around the atoll, and a variety of anti-aircraft weapons were dug in. The American forces on Wake were placed under a US Navy officer, Commander Cunningham. The Japanese first attempted to reduce Wake on the 8th of December 1941. The same day their carrier planes devastated the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Wake being on the opposite side of the international dateline. A bomber offensive was launched that managed to destroy 8 of the Wildcats on the ground, a severe blow to the defenders. On the morning of the 11th of December, a Japanese task force that consisted of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and a pair of large patrol boats, codenamed the South Seas Force, approached the atoll, escorting a pair of troop transports loaded with 450 Special Naval Landing Troops. Incredibly, the American defenders were able to send this force packing, sinking the destroyer Hayate with 5-inch shells from their dug-in and concealed naval guns, and damaging most of the other ships in a hailstorm of shot and shell. The remaining aircraft of VMF-211 took to the skies and managed to bomb and sink the destroyer Kisaragi, forcing the Japanese to place Wake under an aerial siege from land-based medium bombers until a new task force could be constituted. Deeply humiliated by their unexpected defeat, the Japanese invasion force retreated with its tail quite literally between its legs. In the meantime, Admiral Wilson Brown's Task Force 1-4 had left Pearl Harbor and was steaming towards Wake to relieve the defenders. Brown's force included the aircraft carriers, USS Saratoga and Lexington. The problem was that although the warships were quite swift, they had been forced to match their speed to a slow and elderly fleet oiler, and collectively Brown's task force made slow progress towards Wake. Sadly, when the American task force was within 1 day of reaching Wake, Vice Admiral William Pye, acting Commander-in-Chief of what was left of the Pacific Fleet, had second thoughts about risking his carriers in a showdown with a more powerful Japanese fleet known to be converging on Wake for a second invasion attempt, and he ordered Brown to turn about and return his vessels to Pearl Harbor. The American government abandoned the defenders of Wake to their fate, but their refusal to surrender when faced with overwhelming Japanese naval power and to stand and fight to the end proved a huge morale booster to the American public, depressed after the surprise attack on Hawaii. On the 23rd of December, Vice Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka's large invasion fleet arrived off Wake, and after beginning their landings at 2:35 a.m., by the afternoon 1,500 Japanese naval landing troops had come ashore and slowly began to overcome fanatical American resistance, suffering huge casualties in the process. The guns fell silent on Wake on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, 24th of December, the day before the British colony of Hong Kong also surrendered after another heroic last stand. Emerging from their defensive positions, 1,603 American men, military and civilian, placed themselves into the hands of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Most probably assumed that the worst was now over for them, and their timely capitulation had saved many of their lives when it became clear to their commanders that further resistance was completely futile. American honor had been served in making such a stout defense of the island, and to continue to the last man, last round was not normally a part of the Western military ethos. American expectations of decent treatment after having fought so gallantly were swiftly dispelled. The Japanese had lost between 700 and 900 naval personnel in their 2 attempts to take the island, and at least another 1,000 had been wounded. Besides the human cost, Japanese naval pride had been damaged by the loss of 2 destroyers and 20 aircraft. The Americans had come off much better, with a total of 122 killed, including 49 of the garrison's Marines. The Japanese felt that they had been unexpectedly humiliated by this thorn in the side of their otherwise triumphant advance across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and were in a vengeful mood. Collecting up their prisoners, the Japanese found that the majority were actually American civilians, 1,150 employees of the Morrison-Knudsen Company, who had been sent to Wake to construct an airfield, a seaplane base, and a submarine base for the U.S. Navy before the invasion. This only added to the loss of face. The remainder were military prisoners from the U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Navy. Although many of the more junior naval officers were keen to kill the prisoners as soon as possible, Rear Admiral Kajioka, the commander of the Japanese invasion fleet, intervened and forbade any such action. The prisoners were to be kept alive for the time being, and a proper decision would be made higher up the chain of command regarding their ultimate fate. The good news was transmitted to the massed ranks of huddled prisoners, filthy, thirsty, and exhausted after the fight of their lives, by a naval interpreter. "The Emperor has gracefully presented you with your lives," the interpreter announced, to which some wise-cracking American shouted, "Well, thank the son of a bitch." Such self-confidence was soon to be knocked out of the prisoners as their ordeal began to unfold. For 3 weeks the prisoners loitered around their barracks, until one morning a large Japanese merchant ship hove to in the lagoon. She was the Nita Maru, and her mission was to remove the majority of the men to prison camps in China. The Nita Maru departed from Wake on the 12th of January 1942, and into her filthy holds were crammed 1,222 American prisoners. A total of 381 civilian contractors and wounded U.S. Marines were left behind on Wake. 200 of these were later shipped out, but the remaining 98 were brutally massacred by the Japanese Navy once they had outlived their usefulness. Before they boarded the Nita Maru, the Japanese forced the Americans to run the gauntlet, as Commander Cunningham recalled. I had barely picked up one of my bundles when a Jap struck at my hands and tore it from me. It was like a signal. The double line erupted in hate, and as we ran the gauntlet we were dealt kicks, blows and slaps by men who had no part in our capture. Life aboard the Nita Maru, on which food and water was virtually non-existent, for the frozen prisoners huddled together in their own filth in the bowels of the vessel, was unbearable. In our long record of semi-starvation as prisoners of war, and the 12 days we spent in the voyage from Wake were, at least in my estimation, the worst, wrote Cunningham. The Japanese physically abused the prisoners, including the officers, relentlessly. There was a great deal of slapping, wrote Cunningham. Captain Platt was taken out into the passageway one day and beaten with a club for excessive talking. There was a lack of officer supervision, and the guards took it upon themselves to beat the prisoners. The ship arrived in Yokohama in Japan on the 20th of January, and after a short time in port she set sail for China. The Japanese evidently still felt that they had not been given the chance to take out their frustrations on the American prisoners who had fought them so well, and now, away from the gaze of Admiral Kajioka, junior officers plotted a vengeful attack on the defenseless men held down below like animals. The Japanese Guard commander, Lieutenant Toshio Saito, decided to organize a spectacle for both his men and the assembled POWs, an event designed to indicate just how angry the Japanese were over the reverses that they had suffered during the Battle of Wake. Once out at sea, the Japanese Guard suddenly bundled 5 of the prisoners topside. The men, all from the naval air station on Wake, were to be tortured to death in order, said the Japanese, to honor their bravery in the defense of the island. You have killed many Japanese soldiers in battle, announced Saito to a large crowd of American prisoners drawn up on the lurching deck of the ship, as Japanese guards, long bayonets fixed to their rifles, stood eyeing the POWs with undisguised loathing and hatred. Turning to the 5 bound American prisoners, Saito continued, "For what you have done, you are now going to be killed for revenge. You are here as representatives of your American soldiers and will be killed. You can now pray to be happy in the next world." 3 seamen second class, Theodore Franklin, John Lambert, and Roy Gonzalez from Patrol Wing 2, and 2 U.S. Marine Corps NCOs from Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 211, Master Technical Sergeant Earl Hannum and Technical Sergeant Vincent Bailey were brutally executed in front of their shocked and horrified comrades in a sickening display of Japanese military sadism. The bound men were first severely beaten and then beheaded with swords by Japanese naval officers. The headless bodies of the American servicemen were then used by gleeful Japanese soldiers and sailors for bayonet practice, until mutilated beyond recognition they were dumped over the ship's side like bags of refuse. It is not difficult to imagine the mood among the sickened and appalled American prisoners who had been forced to watch this grisly ceremony. It served as a salutary warning of the kind of treatment that they could expect from their captors from here on out. The Nita Maru finally arrived at Shanghai on the 23rd of January 1942. Hardly had the POWs stepped off the gangway onto Chinese soil than they were subjected to fresh abuse from the Japanese. Quote, "One of the guards, a buck-toothed petty officer wearing glasses, ran up and down the line of prisoners, dealing out blows and kicks for no apparent reason other than to satisfy some sadistic cravings," recalled Commander Cunningham. The prisoners' destination was Wuzhong Camp, located in today's Wuzhong suburb of Shanghai and home to a naval base. The camp contained a large proportion of American servicemen, mostly members of the North China Marines, a group detached to guard the U.S. consulate in Beijing and the consulates and concessions at Tianjin, now Tianjin, under the command of Colonel William W. Ashurst, who became senior Allied officer at Wuzong. Wuzong Camp was located close to where the Huangpu River empties into the East China Sea, about 15 miles from the center of Shanghai. At that time, the surrounding area was mostly flat rice paddies, interspersed by small villages and crisscrossed by creeks and canals. One of the few Britons imprisoned at Wuzong was Sir Mark Young, the former governor of Hong Kong, who had been captured by the Japanese when the colony surrendered on Christmas Day 1941. After the war, Young provided the British government with a detailed report about the camp. There were about 1,500 prisoners, and conditions, particularly as regards sanitation, were most unsatisfactory, he recalled. In Shanghai, as elsewhere, the Japanese had deliberately chosen run-down and overgrown sites for the internees, and did nothing to prepare the facilities for occupation in advance of the foreigners' arrival, commented Sir Mark. 3 wooden barracks huts at Wuzong had originally been constructed as a Chinese nationalist barracks before the war, and they were in a decrepit state when Cunningham and his men arrived. The camp covered about 10 acres in total. The Japanese had enclosed the perimeter with an electrified fence. There were 7 barracks, each building about 70 feet long and 25 feet wide. Next to the back door of each hut there was a small squat lavatory and wash rack. Inside each barrack block, a long corridor ran down the center, with a series of rooms on each side that contained hard wooden sleeping bays. Into each barracks, the Japanese had forced between 200 and 300 men, 18 or 20 to a room. This form of overcrowding, much favored by the Japanese authorities, normally encouraged the rapid spread of airborne diseases. The walls of the huts were not insulated, so the prisoners nearly froze to death during the harsh Shanghai winters. The latrines at Wuzong were the worst. Chinese coolies using buckets emptied them by hand. In the summer, Sir Mark Young recalled that huge clouds of black flies swarmed around the latrines, and then invaded the rest of the camp, landing on food and spreading dysentery. The camp was also infested by rats that scampered under the huts and into the kitchen, adding their excrement to the collective filth. The situation that the Americans faced in the camp at Wuzong made Cunningham reflect long and hard on the decisions that he had taken on Wake. I thought of the brave men who had died under my command, and the others who were now mistreated prisoners because I had made the decision to surrender. The sense of responsibility weighed very heavily upon Cunningham's conscience. Over and over I reviewed that decision and others I had made, and I wondered whether different ones might have saved us. But within Cunningham there also grew a desire to escape from the camp and to fight again, to avenge the humiliation of surrender on Wake. At Wuzong, Cunningham shared a room with Lieutenant Commander Columbus Darwin Smith, former commander of the Yangtze River gunboat USS Wake. Smith had been recalled to active duty only a few weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor and ordered to take command of all remaining U.S. Navy installations in Shanghai, following the departure of Rear Admiral William Glassford's ships to the Philippines. Unfortunately, U.S. Navy assets in Shanghai by December 1941 had shrunk to a single small gunboat, and the Wake was effectively mothballed as a warship and permanently moored on the Pudong side of the Bund, astern of the British gunboat HMS Petrel. The Wake had only a skeleton crew of 14 sailors aboard on the morning of the 8th of December 1941, and 8 of these were telegraphists, as the Wake operated as a floating radio relay station between the U.S. Embassy and U.S. Naval Headquarters in Manila. The vessel had already been rigged with scuttling charges in case the Japanese attempted to capture her. Commander Smith lived ashore in a nearby apartment. At 4 a.m., a Japanese boarding party quickly overwhelmed the single American guard and took over the Wake without firing a shot, the only occasion during the war when an American warship would be captured without any resistance being offered. Triumphant Japanese Marines hauled down the Stars and Stripes, and as soon as it was light, photographed themselves with the flag and their rifles, many pumping the air with joy. Smith arrived shortly after the Japanese had taken the ship, and he was refused entry to the vessel. Suddenly, from up ahead, firing broke out. Smith witnessed the destruction of HMS Petrel as her New Zealand skipper, Lieutenant Stephen Polkinghorne, ordered his small ship's company to make a show of force against the Japanese, whose boarding party had been rudely rebuffed just minutes earlier. It was a desperately uneven fight as the elderly Japanese cruiser Izumo bombarded the Petrel, which was only armed with Lewis machine guns, until the vessel was a smashed and blazing wreck. Several British sailors floated face down in the river, killed by the shelling. As Commander Smith watched, the Royal Navy's last warship in mainland China rolled over and sank. The Japanese machine gunned the struggling survivors in the water in one of the first recorded war crimes committed against Allied forces, but some courageous Chinese locals braved the fire to rescue the surviving British sailors and take them to safety in their sampans. British naval honour had been served, but at a cost of 6 men killed. Lieutenant Polkinghorne and the survivors were taken prisoner and marched off to Wuzhong to join the Americans. It was Commander Smith who first outlined a viable escape plan to Cunningham whilst the 2 men were imprisoned at Wuzhong camp. They were joined in their plotting by a British naval officer, Commander John Woolley, who had been serving as a naval attaché at the British Embassy in Shanghai when the Japanese attacked. Also integral to the planning was Dan Teeters, the tough former supervisor of civilian contractors on Wake, as well as a Chinese teenager surnamed Lo, who had been serving aboard the Wake as a ship's boy when the vessel was captured. The escape occurred on the night of the 11th of March 1942. Avoiding the perimeter guards, the 5 men carefully dug out a shallow pit beneath the perimeter fence wire and slipped under. Moving silently across country, the escapees arrived on a bank of the Yangtze River. Commander Smith's plan was to move downstream in search of a sampan. The escapees would then steal the boat and ride the tide to Pudong, an area of Shanghai lined with warehouses and godowns opposite the Bund, and a district whose scattered villages were heavily infiltrated by nationalist Chinese guerrillas. Smith felt sure that the escapees could soon link up with the guerrillas and with their help make their way to Chungking, now Chongqing, and freedom. Smith's plan was ambitious, for the group had not built any contacts with the Chinese underground before breaking out of Wuzhong, and the loyalties of the local population could not be counted upon. Lo, the Chinese ship's boy, tried in vain to convince Smith and the others to go west instead of heading for Pudong. Strangely enough, wrote Cunningham, we paid no attention to Lo. Convinced that Smith knew what he was doing, we ignored the advice of a man native to the area and took the word of an Occidental who said he knew better. The group followed the river to where it joined up with the Huangpu River, the waterway that flows past Shanghai and Pudong. Their search for a sampan was ultimately fruitless, and the group wasted many hours scouring the riverbank. With daylight rapidly approaching, Smith knew that they must find some cover, and so they broke into a deserted barn and hid. Approaching the farmer for help proved their undoing. The farmer appeared to be sympathetic, but he betrayed them to Chinese government troops loyal to the quisling Wang Qingwei regime that the Japanese had established in Nanking. Lo attempted to bargain with the Chinese troops, but all talk of Allied rewards for a safe return of POWs evaporated when heavily armed Japanese soldiers arrived on the scene and surrounded the barn. Smith, Cunningham, and the others emerged with their hands above their heads and were herded on board an army truck and taken to Wuzhong jail. Somewhat surprisingly, considering its fearsome reputation, the Japanese Kempeitai military police did not beat and torture the escapees. Our interrogators actually seemed to be in good spirits about something, recalled Cunningham. The reason was that the regular Japanese army, represented in this instance by the aristocratic Wuzhong camp commandant, Colonel Yuzei, despised the Kempeitai. The fact that we had escaped from him and had then been recaptured by them, filled them with such glee that they were almost grateful to us for the chance to humiliate Yuzei. The Kempei Tai further eroded Colonel Yuzei's already much reduced face by taking Smith and the others back to Wuzong camp and forcing them to recreate their escape for the express purpose of showing Yuzei just how bad security at his camp was. The Kempei Tai also insisted that all of the Wuzong prisoners sign a paper agreeing not to try and escape, or we would be killed, recalled Sergeant Robert Arthur. The Wake Island personnel refused to sign, so we were labelled dangerous prisoners and shipped to a prison camp at Kawasaki in Japan. On the 13th of March 1942, Smith, Cunningham, Woolley, Teeters and Lowe were sent to the infamous Kempei Tai torture centre that was located in a big white apartment block called Bridge House, just north of the Bund over Gurdon Bridge in Shanghai. There they were to await trial. Again, the escapers were not subjected to any maltreatment, though the cells to which they were confined were very small and overcrowded, and they remained locked up for 18 hours a day. Foreign prisoners at Bridge House were expected to subsist on only 1 pound of bread and 2 ounces of sugar a day. The escapees remained at Bridge House for 33 long days, until they were suddenly marched out and put aboard a truck to Kyangwon Military Prison outside Shanghai on the 15th of April 1942. On arrival, they were strip-searched and then arraigned before a Japanese military court-martial. The Japanese did not consider Allied captives to be prisoners of war, instead treating them as military prisoners of the Imperial Army and therefore under Army regulations. So, escape, while the duty of a prisoner under agreed international law, was deemed to be desertion by the Japanese authorities and carried with it these severe punishments reserved for Japanese soldiers who attempted it. The Japanese permitted no defense by the prisoners, even though they had prepared one. Following the show trial, the prisoners were forced into tiny solitary confinement cells for 7 weeks and left to await the verdict of the court. Each cell had concrete walls, a wooden floor, no furniture, and the prisoners were only permitted 35 minutes exercise each day. A single day of solitary confinement can be torture in a cell that had a small window that was too high to look out of. 7 weeks can seem like a lifetime, wrote Cunningham. In their usual unpredictable manner, the Japanese suddenly announced on the 2nd of June that the men would be tried again. The Kempei Tai was evidently not satisfied with the first kangaroo court. This time, Smith, Cunningham and the others tried to raise the question of the Hague and Geneva Conventions that prescribe 30 days solitary confinement as the maximum penalty for escape attempts. The Japanese prosecutor contended that his nation was not bound by any such agreements, which was a half-truth, for Japan had signed, though not ratified, the Geneva Convention. Once again, the Wuzong escapees were tried under the provisions of Japanese military law as deserters from the Imperial Army. Unsurprisingly, all of the defenders were found guilty and sentenced to various terms of imprisonment. Commanders Smith, Cunningham and Woolley each received 10 years, Teeters 2 years and Lowe just 1 year. "It didn't sound good," commented Cunningham, "but it was a lot better than being shot. We almost beamed at the senior officer." In fact, these sentences appear to be remarkably lenient when compared with other cases of recaptured Allied POWs, and the initially amused attitude of the Kempei Tai shortly after their apprehension in Pudong may explain the non-fatal sentences. 7 days later, the prisoners were removed to Ward Road Jail, an old British prison in Shanghai, where they were to serve out their sentences. At Ward Road, the escapers were in for an initially uncomfortable time, since the Japanese now commanded the facility, having interned the British warders alongside the Caucasian officers of the Shanghai Municipal Police, the SMP. The new prison governor was a Japanese named Sugai, a former SMP officer. The prisoners were forced to relinquish their military uniforms in exchange for prison garb. They spent between 18 and 20 hours a day locked up in their cells, though the conditions were a slight improvement over those at Kyangwon and Bridge House. The escapees could write 1 letter home each month, though as punishment for having escaped from Wuzong they were denied tobacco or any packages from home, but they could receive short notes from their families. On the 9th of July 1942, 4 U.S. Marines joined Cunningham, Smith, and the others. Corporals Connie Wattles, Charles Brimmer, and Gerald Story, along with Private First Class Charles Stewart, had escaped from Wuzong Camp on the 31st of March 1942. Like Smith and the naval escapees, the U.S. Marines had been picked up just over 2 weeks later on the 17th of April, having failed to find any assistance from the local population. Like the first escapees, the Marines were placed on trial for desertion. "We had no counsel during our trial for escaping from Wuzong," wrote Corporal Story. "When the trial was over, we were informed that Battles, Stewart, and I were sentenced to 4 years in prison, and that Brimmer was sentenced to 7 years. Brimmer had admitted that he was the ringleader of the escape. Actually, this was not the case, but Brimmer admitted to the fact to stop the beatings. Unlike Commander Smith's group, the Kempe Tai had subjected the U.S. Marines to extensive physical abuse at Bridge House. We can only surmise that the attitude of the Japanese to escape attempts had hardened since the recapture of Smith and his party, and when it became known amongst the other POWs that the Japanese severely beat prisoners who tried to escape, such an admission would have had an undoubted effect on future escape attempts. When they told Brimmer that he got 7 years, we all started to laugh and told him he would be an old man before he left the prison," recalled Story. "As we started to walk out of the courthouse, the Japs called us back and raised Brimmer's sentence to 9 years, evidently because we had laughed." In July 1943, another Caucasian prisoner was added to the escapees who were mouldering away at Ward Road Jail. Patrick Herndon, an American civilian, was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment for fighting with other prisoners at Wuzong. During his imprisonment, Commander Cunningham's thoughts turned once more to escape. No one had ever managed to break out of Ward Road Jail, but the plucky American decided that he must try. But a bad bout of diarrhea put paid to Cunningham's plans. By February 1944, Cunningham's physical condition had deteriorated badly, with his weight down from 185 to just 129 pounds. A doctor diagnosed nervous indigestion, and Cunningham was sent to the Shanghai Police Hospital for 3 weeks' treatment during February and March. A new rule at Ward Road allowed prisoners to buy food through the Swiss consulate, meaning that Cunningham's health improved markedly. By September, his weight was up to 167 pounds. In May 1944, 2 other American servicemen arrived at Ward Road, each having been sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment following an attempted escape from Wuzong Camp. U.S. Marine Sergeant Coulson and U.S. Navy pharmacist Mate Second Class Brewer soon after joined the growing intrigue that circulated around Commanders Smith and Cunningham concerning the planning of a fresh escape attempt. 2 Danish prisoners named Pedersen and Olafsen were released from Ward Road in September 1944. Cunningham had arranged for them to sling a bag containing hacksaws over the perimeter wall at an agreed time and place. But Cunningham's plans were thrown into some disarray by an internal squabble among the would-be escapers. Smith had formed his own faction that consisted of himself, Royal Navy Commander Woolley, and U.S. Marine Corporal Story. It appears that Commander Smith had made a separate deal with the Dane Pedersen, and Smith was the first to receive some hacksaws. Although Cunningham's group was able to obtain tools as well from Pedersen, Smith's group was given a head start and began making preparations to escape immediately. It was only Cunningham's strident opposition that eventually convinced Smith to work together with his superior officer, especially after Cunningham pointed out during a heated exchange that Naval Headquarters would not have looked favourably upon Smith if he had left the commander of Wake Island languishing in a Japanese prison. Eventually, and after much wrangling and argument, Smith and Woolley asked Cunningham to join their group, but Cunningham argued that all 8 Americans should join, something Smith was not keen on. After more negotiations, the agreed solution was for Smith's group to break out of the prison first. Cunningham's group, consisting of Cunningham, pharmacist Mate Brewer, Corporal Brimmer and Private Stewart, would follow on behind 1 hour later. Corporal Battles elected to remain behind because of illness. Initially, the plan worked perfectly. Smith's group removed their cell window bars, seriously weakened by days of covert soaring with the illicit hacksaws, and went over the perimeter wall undetected. They headed off across country and successfully made contact with nationalist Chinese guerrillas. Smith, Woolley, and Story would travel on foot and by sampan for an astounding 700 miles into the Chinese interior, dodging Japanese patrols and betrayal at every turn, until they were passed on to nationalist territory and freedom. Cunningham's group was much less fortunate. They also managed to escape from the prison, but after making it on foot to Suzhou Creek, the tributary of the Huangpu River that flows through Shanghai, they were cornered and captured by Chinese police. It must have been a truly crushing psychological blow for Cunningham to have successfully escaped from Japanese prisons twice and failed to get away twice. The consequences of this escape attempt were to be somewhat different to his last attempt with Commander Smith in 1942. The Kempei Tai removed Cunningham's group to Bridge House, and the two Danes, Pedersen and Olofsson, were also arrested and tortured. Some suspect that Pedersen actually betrayed the Smith-Cunningham escape plan to the Japanese. Cunningham was thrown into a small cell that overflowed with Chinese prisoners, fed a very limited diet, and was forced to endure filth and body lice as washing was strictly forbidden. On the 3rd of November 1944, Cunningham was transferred to Qiangnang Military Prison, and he endured 11 weeks of solitary confinement, causing his intestinal disorder to reassert itself. His weight dropped to 115 pounds, and he started to develop the tropical deficiency disease beriberi. The only thing that gave me cheer during the frightful winter of 1944-45 were the bombings of the prison area. 8 days after I arrived at the prison, the bombs started falling. Some were close enough to shake the building. Shanghai was targeted several times by American B-25 bombers during the latter part of the war, the US AAF concentrating on Japanese military facilities and naval vessels. On the 11th of December 1944, Cunningham's group, plus the Danes Pedersen and Olofsson, were hauled before another court-martial. Cunningham received a life sentence for his latest escape attempt. "I was relieved that it wasn't death," he wrote. "This was the 3rd time that I had faced hard-looking Japanese army officers." Corporal Brimmer also received a life sentence. It later emerged that the Kempei Tai had tortured him into making an admission that he was the group's ringleader. Stewart, Brewer, and Coulson each received 8 years imprisonment, while Pedersen and Olofsson were found guilty of having aided and abetted the escape, and they were sent back to Ward Road Jail for 2 years each. Cunningham and his group did not remain in Shanghai for long. The 19th of January 1945, in the depths of a freezing winter, Cunningham and his companions were placed aboard a train that chugged its way several hundred miles inland to the old nationalist capital at Nanking. "I weighed about 115 pounds and suffered increasingly from my stomach," remembered Cunningham. "I was starting to lose the will to live." After a further period of solitary confinement in Nanking Military Prison, Cunningham was placed in a cell with Pat Herndon, his old comrade from Ward Road Jail, and Corporal Wattles. But although extremely sick and underweight, the Japanese did not spare him from punishment. On the 25th of June 1945, less than a month before the end of the war, the Japanese found Cunningham guilty of having been present in a cell when a window was broken. Although not guilty of having damaged the window pane, Cunningham was fitted around the waist with a thick leather belt, to which his 2 hands were securely lashed for 15 days. By the spring of 1945, the precarious health of Captain Cunningham, for he had been promoted in absentia by the US Navy, backdated to 1943, began to improve. The visible signs of the impending end of the war also lifted his spirits, not the least of which were the American bombing raids on Nanking. The Japanese sent their white prisoners, including 4 of Colonel Doolittle's famous flyers, to Beijing, which at this time was called Beiping, by train on the 1st of August 1945. Cunningham sat handcuffed to another prisoner during the mammoth 46-hour journey. On arrival in Beijing, Cunningham was sent once again to solitary confinement in a military prison until the 18th of August 1945. On the 13th of August, Cunningham noticed that the Japanese were burning huge piles of documents. "We deduced that the Japanese were burning records, and our spirits soared," wrote Cunningham. Although the Japanese surrendered on the 15th of August, it was 3 days later before Cunningham and the other prisoners were brought before the camp commandant and informed of this momentous news. Standing stiffly before them, the rather crestfallen Japanese officer launched into a short speech. "The war is over," stated the commandant, adding rather optimistically, "We hope the Americans and the Japanese will shake hands and become friends again." Cunningham and his friends were immediately moved to a civilian internment camp located at Fengtian, west of Beijing. "Before I turned in for the night, I took a stroll around the camp. It was something I had not been able to do for 3 years and 8 months, recalled Cunningham. I revelled in the sight of the stars, not just a few as seen through a barred window, but all of them. For the first time I could walk as long as I liked and stay up as late as I chose. Glorying in this apparently trifling privilege, I found myself realizing at last that I was free." An Army Emergency Liaison Team made contact with the inmates at Fengtian on the 23rd of August. The next day, Captain Cunningham boarded a B-24 Liberator and flew to Xi'an in western China. On the 25th, he flew on to the nationalist capital at Chongqing before embarking on a journey home that would take him halfway around the world via Kunming, Calcutta, Agra, Karachi, Abidjan, Cairo, Tripoli, Casablanca, the Azores, and Newfoundland, eventually arriving in New York City on the 7th of September 1945. The next day, Cunningham arrived home at his house in Annapolis, Maryland, to the embraces of his wife and children. In 1946, Cunningham received a Presidential Unit Citation and the Bronze Star for his defense of Wake. He would return to China one last time in 1947, when he commanded the USS Curtis and put into the east coast port of Qingdao. Winfield Cunningham retired from the U.S. Navy in 1950 with the rank of Rear Admiral and died in Memphis, Tennessee in March 1986 at the age of 86. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my video channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.